Last week, we began a short study of simply chapters 8, 9, and 10. We began with chapter 8 last week. We looked at the condition of the church in Corinth, and we found them to be divided, selfish, and contentious, and immature. And to make matters worse, we found them that they appear to be blind to their condition. Now, for their sakes, I will keep in mind that, or simply say that if we look in the book of 2 Corinthians, we see that they received Paul's correction with humility and made changes. So we're glad to know that and have that record in 2 Corinthians. But we're looking at what Paul was dealing in 1 Corinthians and what we can learn from that. So the focus today in chapter 9, if you've taken a chance to look at chapter 9 beforehand, you're going to see that Paul uses himself as an example. He has called them to a certain standard, and now he's going to show them by his own example that he lives to that standard that God has provided. So just as a reminder, our class is open for discussion. So for our visitors, Brian and Kendra, I hope I got those names right. If you feel like chipping in, you go right ahead. There is a sheet at the back. Make sure if anybody got the sheet at the back with the questions on it. If you want to use the questions, you don't need to, but they are there at the back. Okay. So we'll begin. We do notice in chapter 4, before we begin, that Paul did say to the Corinthians that he would use himself as an example for them. He said in chapter 4, verse 14, he said, "I do not write these things to shame you, but as my beloved children I warn you. For though you might have 10,000 instructors in Christ, yet you do not have many fathers. For in Christ Jesus I have begotten you through the gospel. Therefore I urge you, imitate me. For this reason I have sent Timothy to you, who is my beloved and faithful son in the Lord, who will remind you of my ways in Christ, as I teach everywhere, in every church." So Paul's already told them, he's corrected them for their actions. He's told them that they need to look at the example that he sets in his service to God and to others. So let's begin in chapter 9. We'll look at the first 6 verses, and then we'll answer what questions we have. Paul writes and says, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working?" So our first question is, according to verses 1 to 6, what rights, what liberties did Paul have as an apostle? Do they have any thoughts on that? He did state that there were certain rights that he had. We read that he had a right to, how did he put it, eat and drink. Now, of course, everyone is able to eat and drink, so I don't think that's what actually Paul is referring to, is the actual act of eating and drinking. But he had a right to his daily bread. He had a right to be provided for those things, for the work that he did. Any other thoughts on what rights or liberties that Paul had? Is that Bill?
Well, first, he was dealing with it seems Christians that were examining him.
Yes, that's true.
Maybe, they were back talking, maybe they were complaining.
Yes.
Or maybe they were saying, like, you're an apostle, you don't have a right to these things.
Right. Bill brings up a good point that we'll notice throughout the book of 1 Corinthians, if you read right through, you'll see that there seems to be some people who are questioning Paul, examining Paul, judging Paul. That's how he began the book. And he's saying that some were choosing some teachers over another. Oh, I prefer to Cephas. I prefer to follow Peter. I'm Apollos. I follow Apollos. So yeah, some were judging. So Paul is saying that as an apostle, he has certain rights or liberties. Any other thoughts on question 1?
He also has a right to take a wife.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, because he was a single guy and he lived in wine.
Right. Yep. And notice in verse 5 that Carla mentions, she talks about verse 5 there, he also knows, as do also the other apostles. So very simply, Paul is saying, does he not have the same rights or liberties as all the other apostles? Why should he be treated or treated as any less than the others? That would not be correct or right to do. So essentially, Paul's introducing the idea that as basically a full-time apostle, that's what he did. He worked in the gospel. That he should have those rights or liberties that were shared by the apostles. So we'll continue on. Jeremy?
Did you? I was at the back.
Okay.
Did you talk about his liberty to be paid for the work that he did?
Yes, actually.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get to that also.
Right.
Yes.
I'm saying that goes into the liberty as well.
Yes.
Like as far as it can be a responsibility of the church, but it also is a liberty to. And a lot of people today, and in spite of what 1 Corinthians chapter 9 says, talks about, well, we shouldn't pay those who preach the gospel. Well, I said, there is a choice. Again, it's liberty.
Right.
Yes, but to come along and say it's unscriptural, that seems to be the attitude of the Corinthian church.
Right.
Is that, well, you don't have the same rights that everyone else does because you're not an apostle of Jesus Christ like Peter is,
Right.
or like John is.
Right.
And so you don't have those same rights, which is wrong.
All right, we'll keep that in mind. Jeremy brings up, of course, the point of Paul's support, and whether he was worthy or deserving, or whether he should even have support. So let's, Francis?
Thank you. My question is, was Paul, was he getting rid of the rights? Like, did somebody take the rights from him? The right to marry, the right to work?
It seems they were questioning.
And it seems, instead of the Corinthian church to be happy with his decision not to marry, not to work, but to do only God's work, it seems they look down on him rather than to be happy for him, to cherish that good work that he's doing. But my question is, who took that right from Paul? Was it himself or God?
Well, we're going to find as we go through. We'll continue on and we'll see what rights or liberties that Paul had and how he had those rights or liberties, how he used them. So good thought, and keep that as we go through. So our next section will be verses 7 to 10. This is sort of a small section where Paul is going to lay out a general principle. So we're going to look at what that is, and then we're going to continue on in 11 to 18 and see how that's applied. So in verses 7 to 10, we read, "Whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? And then Paul says, for our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. So considering what Paul has just said there, question 2 on our question sheet is, what is the general principle we learn in those verses? Verses 7 to 10. Any thoughts? Dion, did you have a thought? Oh. Any general principle from those verses?
It seems to me that a person is worthy of the wages, is worthy to be rewarded for the work that they do.
Okay.
A farmer is rewarded from the fruit of his field. He gets to eat of the fruit of his field. A soldier is rewarded with being paid for the work that he does. And so we sometimes don't think a preacher or elders or people who work for the gospel, that's not a real job. And so you don't deserve to be paid for that. And Paul lays out a principle that the law of Moses, for our sakes, showed us to show love and compassion and mercy to those who do work. The oxen, yet God was taking care of the oxen, but it was more for us to remind us that when we work, there is benefit that comes from that. At least that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeremy is making the point that the principle seen here is that it is a general principle that we are rewarded for the work that we do. In reality, how many people here are going to go to work Monday morning if you are not going to be rewarded for your work? You're not actually going to earn a paycheck. Well, okay. Well, there will be some people working on Monday morning. But for those who are not, they will begin on Tuesday morning. Igor is correct. But even those who start on Tuesday morning, who's going to go to work if you don't get paid for it? If you're not rewarded for your work, if you earn nothing for the things that you do, who's going to do that? And the examples that Paul gave, who's going to, you're going to be a soldier in an army, but you're going to provide everything yourself. You bring your own armor, you bring your own sword, you bring your own food. No, that's not how that works. But you don't do that. Same with planting a vineyard. You don't plant a vineyard and get nothing from it after the work that you do. It is simply put that the things that we do provide for our needs. And Jeremy makes the point that some people will look on the gospel preacher, but they measure things based on the amount of physical activity people do, I think. If you're not physically working at things, you're somehow less than. But that's not, it's the amount of effort and devotion you put into your work. Whether you work in a physically demanding job or you work in a job that's mentally demanding. It is the devotion and effort you make in your work. Jeremy?
I said, and even in secular jobs, some it can happen on both ends of the spectrum. That you look down on people who do different types of work. So if you have a desk job that pays $100,000 a year, and a construction worker who may earn $70,000 a year, well, we might look down like someone who's earning $100,000. Well, they're not doing the same type of work that I'm doing, and it can happen the other way too. I'm doing a lot more work than it seems like they're doing, and so we can get covetous and jealous and envious of what other people are doing. They're both doing work. They're just doing a different type of work.
Right.
And both need to understand each other.
That's right. And Jerry's making the simple point is when we judge people by our own standards, that's when we have trouble. I think, well, that person's not doing something that I think is very important. Our standards don't really matter, and especially when we're referring to the standard of the Word of God and working in the gospel. I call it.
So, as far as him has the liberty to work, he did practice that. He was a tent maker.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, for whatever reason, like over judging him and this and that, he decided he had a job too, apart from preaching the gospel.
Yes, sure.
And when it comes to Corinth, and I think that's how they were judging him. He's not an apostle because he's a tent maker. Because we learned he was a tent maker in Corinth, in Acts. Like as far as we find out why he was a tent maker in Corinth from chapter 9 of 1 Corinthians. We'll get to it in a moment. But I think that's part of the reason probably why they were looking down on Paul. Is Peter didn't do what Paul did. Peter, from everything we read, was an elder in the church and devoted himself almost full time, it seems, to the gospel. Whereas Paul in Corinth was a tent maker and a preacher of the gospel. And so they said, well, what? Like I said, he can't really be an apostle, therefore he shouldn't have the rights of an apostle. At least that's where I'm gathering from chapter 9.
Yes. Jeremy's right. There are some reasons why some people might look down on Paul. Number one, he did, as Colin mentioned, he worked. That might have been some indication to people that, he's less than the regular apostles. He works for a living. He makes tents. But also, we know for a fact that Paul was not one of the original disciples that was with the Lord for those years. Well, there's another reason people might think, he's less than the other ones. They were there with Jesus. He's what we call the Johnny come lately. He's an after the fact type of person, right? Did anyone else have a hand up? Bill?
You saw Paul, he reminded them in verse 1 there right away, am I not an apostle? So we know he has authority.
Yes.
Same as all the apostles.
Yes.
But yet he goes on to make it known, at least in my way of thinking, that we're all on a level playing field as Christians.
Yes.
And sometimes, though, the biggest complainers are usually the ones that don't want to do their part.
Right.
And so then they look to others.
Yes.
And maybe, that was a problem with some of the Corinthians.
Yes.
Paul trying to make that known.
Right. And and Bill brings up a good point there. We have to bring ourselves back to remembering the problems that they had in Corinth. This is why they're having these issues, because their hearts are not right in the first place. They're divided, they're contentious. There's a number of selfish interactions. Gord, did you have a point before we move on?
I think, too, that Paul's past reputation impacted a lot of people, too. Right?
Yes, of course, that too.
You were a Pharisee persecuting us at one time.
Right.
So some probably still hung on to that and didn't fully trust him.
Right. Gord makes another good point. Looking at Paul, not only was he not one of the original apostles, disciples with Christ, but he was originally a persecutor of the church. Wow. By appearance sake, and Jesus tells us don't judge by appearance sake, this doesn't look good. However, Jeremy pointed out Bill pointed out, he has the apostleship given by God. He has done the works of an apostle. He does the miraculous works given by God. In every way and form, God has witnessed that he is Christ's apostle. All right, so we'll continue on into now 11 and 18. Now Paul is going to bring this principle that he's talking about. Now he's going to bring it to himself. So I'll read verses 11 and 18. He says, if we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, he says, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me, for it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. What is my reward then? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. So that's how Paul is applying it to himself, his example, what his rights and liberties are. So and our third question is a thought question, is about Paul's attitude. What attitude did Paul require the Christians have when we look back in chapter 8, in verse 9? He required them to beware of their liberties in case it becomes a stumbling block to others. And in verse 13 of the previous chapter, Paul had said, if therefore food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. So that's the standard that he set for them. So according to these verses, 11 to 18, how is Paul practicing what he preaches when he uses himself as an example for them? So that's what he's done. He laid himself out before them. He's shown what his example is in serving God. Call it.
Well, sometimes what you go through and you want to make a point, you have to tell people what you experience in certain areas.
Yes.
So, like basically, you say, I've been there, I've done that, and so on. And his whole thing is to win people and influence them to become, well, he said, imitate me as I imitate Christ before. So
Right.
he's got that task to do, because there are people after him to be judges, jury, and executioner after him.
Right. Yes.
Instead of basically, that's what when you're attacked, you have to. And he chose the right way and manner.
Right.
His speeches were seasoned with salt, with grace, to win them over.
Right. Very good. James? Sir?
And he set an example by doing what is voluntary. He wasn't boasting about what the abilities that he had.
Right.
And he take on the duty to serve Christ and not to magnify himself. So voluntary. He showed us we should do what we do voluntary.
Very good.
Not about the pain. You have the ability to God to give. Whatever it is.
James brings up a very good point. I think we need to notice that's one of our takeaways here, I would think, is that what he chose to do voluntarily, willingly. Because the Lord has already commanded what the pattern is. He said so. The Lord commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But he said, I have not used those things. Now that was what the Lord expects us as Christians to do. But that doesn't mean, clearly, that Paul can't voluntarily or willingly decline to take those things if there is a necessary case for it. So Paul has a reason, and he's willing to do it. He's willing to lay aside what his right or liberty is to be provided for, as far as and remember, this is as far as the Corinthian church goes, because we know when we read in other places, we read in 2 Corinthians and we read in the book of Philippians, that Paul took from other churches in order to help certain churches, such as a church in Corinth. So it's not that he simply refused what God required of him, but he chose willingly and voluntarily when he would apply that. And that was his choice. The Lord gave him the liberty to do that, and he used it concerning the Corinthian church. I think Bill had a point earlier.
Well, just about verse 19.
Oh yeah, we'll get to 19. Just hold your thought, and we'll be there shortly.
No,
okay.
Same thing.
Okay, very good. All right. So when we look and we think, does Paul practice what he preaches? Because in chapter 8, he certainly expected them to be aware of the conscience of others. Well, what we're realizing is Paul does that. He worries about the conscience of others, and yet he goes more than that. Because really, if you think about it, if all I had to do is worry about other people's conscience, I would just make sure I do what I want. I just make sure no one else sees that. That is not specifically what Paul is expecting from Christians. He is expecting their heart and mind to be in it, and in every way to be concerned about the needs of others. Jeremy?
I said it's one thing if some things are private. Like as far as we know things are right, I'm not going, like as far as with eating meat, for instance, right? That's a private thing, and I'm fully in it when not causing others to stumble by it, but if it's a completely private thing. Now this is not a completely private thing.
Right.
Like as far as Paul is saying that here, that whether or not he takes support, people are going to know that. And so he guards against the conscience of others, that he is not going to be the cause of someone stumbling over his liberty.
Yeah. Before we move to the next section, does anybody, it may not specifically be here, but does anybody have any idea of certain reasons why Paul did this for the Corinthian church? I think we might have already touched on a couple of them. But is there any thoughts on why Paul was doing this for the church in Corinth?
Well, maybe they're looking at his motive.
Okay.
Right? Is he doing it to get something out of it?
Okay.
Or is he doing it to give them something out of it?
Okay. Right. So Gord mentions a key point, is that he wants to make sure that they don't question his motive for why he would take things, support from them. Because number one, we know they're an immature church. We've already discussed that. It's if you want to think about immaturity, you don't have children, little babies in your family and expect for them to provide for the parent. The mature provides for the immature until the immature grow up, and then the immature can start doing what's their responsibility in providing for others. But also, did you have a point here?
I said you also take a look at the temples in Corinth. Others were out, or others, like as far as people in those temples, enriched themselves. And so Corinth had problems with meats offered to idols, so obviously the idol temples were stumbling blocks for people. And so Paul didn't want people to think that he's just like them.
Right.
And so, like as far as there seemed to be a bit of that as well.
Right. Yeah, Jeremy brings up the point, there is an influence of idol temples, and idol temple worship, and idol temple practices. So he doesn't want to do anything where some people might get the idea he's just like the idol temples. He's only after their money. Because again, being immature, not being able to rationally understand things, they needed that patience from Paul. That's why Paul refers to himself more as a father figure to them spiritually, because he's like raising up little children to understand the gospel. And there's one other point in 2 Corinthians in chapter 11 and verses 7 to 12. We won't read them now. But it appears that Paul wanted to make sure also that false teachers or dishonest teachers did not have an opportunity to use Paul's example for themselves to take advantage of the Christians at Corinth. So again, he is worried about them. Do you want one more?
I never caught what you said. Or say what I caught what you said, but I never considered what you said until now when it comes to immaturity. Because that's an interesting point, that this church is immature. And so is it really apt for them as immature for Paul to use his liberty, even though he had the right to use his liberty? Because they might misunderstand what he's doing. Like as far as, yeah, there's all this other stuff, but when you brought up that children-parent sort of thing, I had never considered that before. That's an interesting distinction you made.
Yeah. All right, so we'll move ahead then. So our next section then would be in 19 to 23. And we're going to look at what Paul's attitude is here. So Paul writes, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you." So looking at those verses there, Paul has really brought it to his full point of his attitude. So question 4, in those verses, what do you see as Paul's attitude towards others, and what do you see as reason for that attitude? Gord?
He was willing to make changes to himself according to who he was engaging,
Okay.
so that he may be, the people who he was engaging would be comfortable around him and hear him.
Good.
The hopes of women.
It's a good point. One we should notice immediately. Always willing to make changes for himself. What we would call compromising yourself. You're compromising yourself. It might be your own right or your own liberty. We think about it. Did Paul ever compromise the truth at any point? No. Absolutely. Jeremy instantly, no. Never once, not for a moment. Well, Paul would not give an inch in compromising the truth. But would Paul compromise himself?
Yes.
Apparently to the utmost.
So let's say Paul was a wealthy man. Would he wear his gold and jewelry and fancy clothes when he's dealing with the poor?
Right.
Right? He would go on their level so that they wouldn't feel intimidated and want to open up to him.
Yeah. So, Jeremy?
So on that point, we see an example of what Paul did concerning circumcision. When it came to, it was Timothy, I think.
Yeah, Timothy and Titus.
Timothy, was it Silas? It was Timothy and Silas, or whoever it was. Like as far as it was definitely Timothy, but he asked Timothy to circumcise himself so that he could work among the Jews, because that would have hindered the gospel. However, when the Jews commanded, I think it was Silas, whoever it was, that he circumcised Silas as a means of salvation, then Paul said, no, that's not right. Because he doesn't have to become a Jew in order to be a Christian. And so there's the difference between, all right, it's the same act, but the reasoning behind it was different.
The reason made a difference.
And so we can see that in how Paul applied that in his actions.
Yes. Yeah. Deanne, did you have a point?
So when Paul said to become all things to all men, in today's society, what would that look like? Like if you're ministering to a Muslim or something like.
Well, it would involve, without getting into a specific on each particular thing, what it would involve is whatever we can compromise ourselves in. If I know someone belongs to some sort of man-made religion, but they refrain from doing something, well, I can also refrain from doing that, because I can do it willingly and voluntarily. That's my choice. So I can refrain simply for their conscience, because I don't want them to cause too much concern in their mind while they're learning about the gospel of Christ. So in whatever way we could compromise ourselves for others, but never could we compromise ourselves for the sake of the truth. And that's what it comes down to. Now, if someone if someone belongs to some sort of religion, well, I'll go there and worship with them. In that way, I will have an opportunity to try and steer them away from that. But when I go and worship like they worship, I'm doing exactly what Paul condemns, basically idolatry. I can't do that.
That's chapter 10.
Yeah, but yeah, that will be chapter 10 when we get to it. Yeah.
But I might come along, and there was a preacher who used his example because he lives in Pennsylvania, and he sometimes will work among the Amish, and the Amish, of course, have certain dress, white shirts, no fancy anything. And so when he went among the Amish to teach them, he would dress like them. Because it had nothing to do with anything other than dress. He's not going to say, well, don't you know the scriptures teach this? Well, that's not the point yet. So they first have to become a Christian properly. And then other things might fall by the wayside. But he didn't want to offend them right off the bat because that's going to inhibit his ability to teach them.
Right. They won't even have the opportunity to hear the truth if in that situation, if you've offended them immediately. That's a good example that Jeremy makes. A preacher who was trying to teach Amish people. The Amish people dress a certain way, so he chose to dress in a similar way, so he did not offend them, because he's free to dress how he chooses. There's no commandment from the Lord on how we dress.
Well, there is.
Provided it's modest.
Modesty. That's
Igor was going to get me off. Yes. All right. James?
If you look at Paul's background, we see where he's coming from, and the ability that he had to accommodate people. Because he was once the one who was giving others to persecute the church, and now he changed in such a way, that he could have the ability to reach out to even the lowest,
Right.
and change to accommodate them.
Right.
We have to look at that example, knowing that the objective is to go out and save at any cost.
Good. Yeah. We got to start to condense now because we're in our final minutes.
It's just to say that Christ gave the sinners.
Yes, right. But did not partake in the sin.
No.
So there's the difference, right? Right. Compromise self, never compromise what's true. What James was bringing up, we'll keep in mind for that question 4, was reason. Paul had reasons for doing this. It was for the care of others. It was for the care of the church and the Christians and those who are immature and they need to be built up. It was for care of the lost. And it was care for the sake of their fellowship, because that's actually what it said in 23, the last part. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. It's for fellowship, to unity within brethren. Compromise himself for their fellowship in the gospel, which is going to help them. Paul is telling them all these things for their growth and to correct those problems that they had. They had a problem with division, selfishness, contentions among one another. Well, these are the things that are going to help them solve those problems. How could you have an attitude like Paul in the church? If we have that attitude, how could we fail to have unity and strength in the church if we have that attitude? So our last section, 24 to 27. Paul says, do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. So the last question simply was, what spiritual lessons did Paul want us to learn from the life of an athlete? Are there any thoughts on that before we close it out? Jeremy?
Endurance, like as far as the race is, we think it's a sprint. Paul looks out over the long term. Paul says this is a long race to the end. I need to exercise self-control. That's how a long distance runner can run those long distances. They They control what they eat. They control how they, like as far as their exercise, they control everything. Also, I'm going to control everything because, as we discussed last week, offending the conscience of others is sinful. And so, when Paul's not saying, well, look at me, how all these liberties I give up for you, well, he's doing that because it would lead them to sin.
Yeah.
And so he exercises self-control so that he can win others to Christ and save himself as well.
Mm-hmm. So we'll leave it with that point. That's what Paul wants us to understand. When you look in those examples, know what your goal is, because the athlete does. Know what the effort and sacrifice is you have to make, because the athlete does. And exercise self-control, so otherwise you're not going to reach the goal, because the athlete does that. There is an expression that I thought of when I read through those things and thought about it myself. We have an expression, a sports expression, maybe some of you have heard it. You leave everything on the field. It's an expression we use in sports, or if it's ice, it's leave everything on the ice. But it means to make every effort. Do not finish the game and feel as if I could have done more, and I didn't. It's not that I wasn't capable. I could have, and I didn't. Don't do that. Paul says, leave everything out there. Make every effort.
I'm not ashamed to